He never spoke above a whisper, wore the same weathered leather jacket, cargo pants, and a navy blue watch cap pulled low. His breathing was measured between shots, his aim unwavering. The range officers thought he was just another retired factory worker passing time, until a Marine combat instructor noticed the faded mark on his neck during a ceasefire and went completely still. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Welcome to Unsung Heroes. Before we dive into this tale of quiet courage, hidden valor, and unexpected recognition, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and join our mission to honor those who never sought the spotlight. The Silver Bullet Shooting Center opened at 8 a.m. sharp, but the old man was always waiting by the entrance at 7:45. The morning fog still clung to the pines surrounding the facility, and the gravel parking lot held just two vehicles: his faded blue Ford pickup with a dented rear bumper and the Rangemaster's black Jeep. Neither man acknowledged the other beyond a simple nod, an unspoken ritual they'd maintained for nearly 3 years. The old man signed in with precise handwriting. That never varied: Sullivan. No first name, no membership number, though he paid for an annual pass in cash every January 15th. His signature was neat but efficient, each letter formed with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. "Lane 4 today, Mr. Sullivan?" the Rangemaster would ask, though he already knew the answer. "4 is fine," Sullivan would reply, his voice like sandpaper on oak, rough but measured. Then he'd walk through the indoor facility to the outdoor range, his footsteps making almost no sound, despite the heavy-soled hiking boots he wore year-round. Sullivan's routine never changed. He'd place his simple canvas range bag on the wooden shelf of Lane 4, the one farthest from the clubhouse closest to the tree line. From it, he'd remove exactly 3 items: a worn leather pistol case containing a meticulously maintained Colt 1911 that looked older than most of the range's members, a single box of .45 ACP ammunition, and a scratched metal thermos that smelled of black coffee so strong it could make your eyes water from 3 feet away. The younger shooters called him the ghost behind his back, partly because of how he seemed to materialize each morning without anyone noticing his arrival, and partly because he seemed to exist in a different world from theirs. No smartphone, no fancy tactical gear, no Instagram-ready poses with his firearm. Just a man, his pistol, and an unwavering focus that seemed to bend the very air around him. Most days, Sullivan would fire exactly 40 rounds, no more, no less. 10 rounds at a time, reload, adjust, repeat. He never rushed. Each shot was deliberate, as if he were solving a complex equation rather than simply hitting a target. His groupings were unnaturally tight, a perfect constellation of holes clustered around the center mass of his paper targets. More impressive was that he fired at a pace that seemed almost leisurely, yet his accuracy never wavered. Bet the old man was a cop, one of the regulars speculated over energy drinks and protein bars in the clubhouse. Probably retired SWAT or something. "Nah," another countered, tapping his tactical watch. "Cops talk. They wear the thin blue line caps and the department shirts. That guy doesn't wear anything that says anything." "Maybe he's just a natural," a third suggested, which earned him eye rolls from the others. What none of them realized was that Sullivan heard every word. His hearing was unnaturally sharp for a man his age, which most guessed to be somewhere in his 70s, though his exact age was as much a mystery as everything else about him. That particular Tuesday in March started like any other. Sullivan arrived at 7:45, nodded to the Rangemaster, signed in, and walked to Lane 4. The morning was unusually busy. A certification course for new range safety officers was scheduled for 9 a.m., and a dozen Marines from the nearby base had arrived early to get some practice in before reporting for duty. Sullivan paid them no mind, focusing instead on his own routine. Target up, stance set, breathe in, hold, squeeze, never pull the trigger, breathe out. 40 rounds, 40 holes, all within a circle the size of an apple. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reynolds had been teaching combat marksmanship for 8 years and had seen every type of shooter imaginable. He could tell a showboat from a serious marksman within 5 seconds, and his assessments were rarely wrong. That morning, he'd brought 11 of his Marines to the civilian range to expose them to different shooting environments. Part of his philosophy that adaptability saved lives. Reynolds noticed Sullivan immediately, not because he was flashy or loud, but precisely because he wasn't. In a range full of tactical gear and specialized equipment, Sullivan's minimalist approach stood out like a whisper in a thunderstorm. Reynolds watched from a distance, noting the old man's breathing pattern, his grip, the way he distributed his weight evenly between both feet, with his right foot slightly back. A stance that had largely fallen out of favor in modern shooting. Instruction, but was devastatingly effective in the right hands. "Listen up," Reynolds said quietly to 2 of his Marines who were adjusting their holsters nearby. "See lane 4? Watch his technique. That's old-school precision right there." The Marines observed silently as Sullivan emptied his magazine, each shot finding its mark with metronomic consistency. When the range called a ceasefire to change targets, Sullivan set his pistol down, muzzle downrange, action open, and stepped back from the firing line. Reynolds approached casually, keeping a respectful distance. "Fine shooting, sir," he said, extending his hand. "Staff Sergeant Reynolds, Marine Corps combat instructor." Sullivan turned slowly, his weathered face impossible to read. He took Reynolds' hand with a firm grip that belied his age. "Appreciate it, Sergeant." His eyes, grey like gunmetal, assessed Reynolds quickly, professionally, missing nothing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mind if I ask what unit you served with?" Reynolds asked, his instincts telling him. This was no ordinary civilian. Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a nearly imperceptible straightening of his spine, a slight repositioning of his shoulders. "What makes you think I served?" Reynolds smiled slightly. "Nobody shoots like that without training, and nobody maintains that training for decades without a reason." For a moment, it seemed Sullivan might not answer. Then he reached for his thermos, unscrewing the cap with practiced efficiency. As he tilted his head back to take a sip, the collar of his jacket shifted just enough to reveal the edge of a mark on the side of his neck. Not quite a tattoo in the traditional sense, but a series of numbers and symbols that had been applied. With military precision, Reynolds froze, coffee forgotten. He knew that mark. Few would recognize it, but Reynolds had spent 3 years in military intelligence before becoming an instructor. That specific pattern belonged to a unit so classified that most military personnel believed it was just a rumor, a ghost story told by special operators after too many drinks. "Sierra Unit," Reynolds whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication that Reynolds had struck a nerve. He recapped his thermos deliberately, set it down on the bench, and turned to face the younger man fully. "Been a long time since I heard that name," Sullivan said softly, his voice carrying no further than Reynolds's ears despite the relative quiet of the ceasefire. "Where did you come across it?" Reynolds hesitated, aware that he was treading on sensitive ground. "Joint operation in Helmand, 2012. We provided support for an extraction. Never saw the team, just the aftermath and the briefing code." He paused. "Never thought I'd meet one of you in person." Sullivan studied Reynolds for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate movements, he rolled up the sleeve of his left arm, revealing a forearm corded with lean muscle that men half his age would envy. There, just above his wrist, was a small symbol, a modified arrowhead with 3 stars positioned in a triangle pattern. Beneath it, a single date, 11/04/72. November 4th, 1972, Reynolds breathed, recognition dawning. Operation Kingfisher. Sullivan rolled his sleeve down as methodically as he'd rolled it up. "You've done your homework, Sergeant. They teach us about Kingfisher at advanced courses. It's legendary." Reynolds couldn't keep the awe from his voice. "They said everyone on that mission either died or disappeared. Maybe some just chose to disappear," Sullivan replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. The range officer called the end of the ceasefire, and shooters began to move back to their positions. Sullivan picked up his pistol, checking it with the same care he'd shown all morning. "Sir," Reynolds said quickly, "would you mind if my Marines observed your technique? It would be an honor." For the first time, something resembling a smile crossed Sullivan's face, not quite reaching his eyes but softening the hard lines around his mouth. "Your Marines are welcome to watch, Sergeant." Not sure there's much to learn from an old man, though. Reynolds knew better, but he simply nodded his thanks and returned to his group. "Change of plans," he told them quietly. "We're going to observe Lane 4 for the next 30 minutes. The man shooting there has forgotten more about combat marksmanship than most of us will ever know." The Marines exchanged curious glances but followed orders, positioning themselves where they could see Sullivan without crowding him. Reynolds didn't explain further. Some things were earned, not given, but he watched their expressions as Sullivan resumed his methodical firing pattern. It didn't take long for realization to dawn on their faces. One by one, the young Marines straightened their posture, their casual attitudes replaced by attentive observation. They weren't watching a hobbyist or an enthusiast. They were witnessing mastery in its purest form. Sullivan continued as if they weren't there, but Reynolds noticed subtle changes in his demonstration. He varied his grip slightly, showing traditional and modern techniques in succession. He adjusted his stance between magazines, illustrating the evolution of combat shooting over decades. Without a word of instruction, he was teaching, and the Marines were learning. When Sullivan finally finished his 40 rounds, he secured his weapon with practiced ease and began packing his sparse equipment. Reynolds approached again, this time with genuine reverence. "Thank you, sir. That was educational." Sullivan nodded once. "Your Marines have good fundamentals. Make sure they understand why they do things, not just how. Methods change, principles don't." Reynolds recognized the wisdom in those words. "If you don't mind my asking, sir, how many operations?" Sullivan paused, his hand resting on his closed range bag. For a moment, Reynolds thought he'd overstepped. Then the old man spoke, his voice so low that Reynolds had to lean in slightly to hear. "Officially, none. Sierra Unit didn't exist on paper." He glanced at the Marines waiting respectfully at a distance. "Unofficially, 37 deployments. Across 16 countries. Last one was 89, before most of your Marines were born." Reynolds struggled to maintain his composure. The man standing before him was living history, a member of a unit so covert that their operations were still classified decades later. A team that had operated during the Cold War's darkest hours, executing missions that could never be acknowledged. "Sir, would you consider—" Reynolds began, but Sullivan raised a hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. "I don't do interviews. Sergeant, don't do memoirs or podcasts either." His tone wasn't unkind, just matter-of-fact. "Some stories stay buried for good reasons." Reynolds nodded, understanding completely. "Of course, sir, but would you consider spending a little time with my Marines? Not to tell war stories, Just some practical guidance. No recordings, no questions about operations. Sullivan considered the request, his eyes drifting to the young Marines who stood waiting with a mixture of curiosity and respect. After what seemed like a long time, he gave a single slight nod. Thursday, 0800, I'll be here anyway. With that, he picked up his range bag and walked toward the exit, his footsteps as silent as they'd been upon arrival. Reynolds watched him go, struck by the contradiction of the man, physically present yet somehow ghost-like, ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in capability, advanced in years yet moving with the fluid economy of someone half his age. One of the Marines, Lance Corporal Diaz, a promising shooter with 3 tours already under his belt, approached cautiously. "Staff Sergeant, who was that?" Reynolds turned to his Marines, noting the genuine curiosity and respect in their expressions. "That, Marines, is what excellence looks like after a lifetime of service. Most of what he did will never appear in any history book, and he prefers it that way." "The mark on his neck," Diaz pressed. "I've never seen anything like it." "And you probably never will again," Reynolds replied. "It belongs to a unit that was disbanded before the Berlin Wall fell. Men who operated so deep in the shadows that even their shadows didn't know they existed." The Marines exchanged glances, processing this information with varying degrees of understanding. Reynolds let the moment stretch, then clapped his hands, once breaking the spell. "All right, back to work, and if you're here on Thursday, remember, you listen more than you talk. Men like that don't share wisdom with those who haven't earned the right to hear it." As the Marines returned to their lanes, Reynolds found himself glancing toward the exit where Sullivan had disappeared. In a world of social media operators and tactical influencers, the old man represented something increasingly rare. Someone who had done extraordinary things and never felt the need to tell anyone about them. The range master approached, clipboard in hand. "I see you met our resident ghost," he said with a knowing smile. "How long has he been coming here?" Reynolds asked. "Going on 3 years now. Same time, same lane, same routine." "The range." Master leaned in slightly. "Never missed a day, rain or shine. Pays his membership in cash every January. Leaves no email, no phone number. Just Sullivan on the form." "You know anything about him?" The range master shook his head. "Not really. Lives somewhere up in the hills from what I've gathered. Keeps to himself." He paused. "Funny thing, though, last summer we had that wildfire evacuation, remember? Found out later he spent 3 days helping coordinate rescue efforts. Former fire chief told me the old man knew more about tactical evacuation planning than anyone he'd ever met. Saved a dozen families in the canyon community. Never said a word about it afterward." Reynolds nodded, unsurprised. "Men like that don't do things for recognition." "What exactly did he do?" the range master asked. "Military, I'm guessing, but what branch?" Reynolds considered the question carefully. "Let's just say he served his country in ways most people will never know about." The range master seemed to understand the deliberate vagueness. "Well, whatever he did, he's welcome here anytime. Best damn shooter I've ever seen, and I was an Army marksmanship instructor for 20 years. As Reynolds returned to his Marines, his mind was already racing with questions he knew would never be answered. What missions had Sullivan undertaken? During those Cold War years? What had he seen? What had he done in service to a country that could never officially acknowledge his sacrifice? But even more pressing was a simpler question. What wisdom might Sullivan be willing to share with a new generation of warriors? Reynolds made a mental note to arrive early on Thursday. Some opportunities came once in a lifetime, and this was definitely one of them. Back in the parking lot, Sullivan sat in his truck, watching the range through the rearview mirror. His expression hadn't changed, but internally, memories long suppressed were rising to the surface like bodies in a flood. Images of jungle operations, desert infiltrations, Arctic extractions, missions conducted in places where Americans weren't supposed to be, against enemies who weren't supposed to exist. He started the engine with a practiced motion, the truck rumbling to life like an old dog rousing from sleep. As he pulled away from the Silver Bullet shooting center, Sullivan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Perhaps it was time to pass along some of what he knew, not the classified details or the operational specifics, but the principles that had kept him alive through decades of service in the darkest corners of the world. Thursday would tell. For now, Sullivan drove home to his cabin in the hills, where no neighbors asked questions, and the only visitors were deer and the occasional black bear. Where medals and commendations remained locked in a fireproof safe he hadn't opened in years. Where the ghosts of fallen teammates, sometimes visited in dreams, he never discussed with anyone. Some men shouted their accomplishments from rooftops. Others, like Sullivan, carried them silently, not as burdens, but as sacred trusts. Invisible wars fought by invisible warriors who asked for nothing in return except the knowledge that they had done what needed to be done when their country called. And for Sullivan, that had always been enough. Thursday arrived with a light rain that misted the mountain foothills and left the world feeling freshly washed. The Silver Bullet shooting center's gravel parking lot glistened with puddles that reflected the cloudy sky as Staff Sergeant Reynolds pulled in at 07:30, 30 minutes before his scheduled meeting with Sullivan. To his surprise, 3 additional vehicles belonging to his Marines were already parked in a neat row, a testament to the impression Sullivan had made on Tuesday. Reynolds smiled to himself. Punctuality was a virtue in the Corps, but arriving early was a sign of respect and eagerness that couldn't be taught. He'd only invited 5 Marines to this session, the ones he believed would benefit most, and more importantly, would treat Sullivan's knowledge with the reverence it deserved. The Rangemaster was at his usual post behind the counter, cup of coffee steaming beside his computer. He looked up as Reynolds entered, raindrops still clinging to the Staff Sergeant's cover. "Morning, Reynolds. Your man's already here." The Rangemaster gestured toward the indoor section. "Lane 6 today. Says the outdoor range is too wet for proper footing." Reynolds nodded his thanks and made his way through the facility. The indoor range was quieter than usual, the weather keeping the casual shooters at home. As he approached Lane 6, he saw Sullivan methodically arranging items on the shooting bench, not just his usual minimalist setup, but what appeared to be several additional pistols carefully wrapped in oilcloth, a notebook worn at the edges, and a small wooden box that looked hand-carved. Sullivan glanced up as Reynolds approached, acknowledging him with a slight nod. "Sergeant." "Good morning, sir. Thank you for doing this." Reynolds removed his cover, tucking it under his arm. "I hope we're not imposing on your routine." Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but there was something different in his eyes, a subtle shift from the guarded look he'd worn on Tuesday to something more purposeful. "Been maintaining the same routine for 30 years, Sullivan replied, his voice still that quiet rasp of sandpaper on wood. "Maybe it's time for a change." Before Reynolds could respond, the door opened behind them, and Lance Corporal Diaz entered with 4 other Marines. They moved with disciplined precision, forming a respectful semicircle a few feet from Sullivan's position. None of them spoke, but their eyes conveyed their curiosity and respect. Sullivan studied them carefully, his gaze methodically assessing each Marine from head to toe. Reynolds recognized the look. It was the same clinical evaluation he'd seen in veteran operators, the kind who could read a person's capabilities and weaknesses in seconds. "Your Marines are prompt," Sullivan said finally. "Good start." Reynolds made brief introductions. Lance Corporal Diaz, the natural marksman; Corporal Hernandez, a combat veteran with 2 Purple Hearts; Private First Class Chen, new but promising; Sergeant Wilson, a seasoned squad leader, and Corporal Jackson, the unit's designated marksman. Sullivan listened without comment, his weathered hands resting lightly on the bench. When Reynolds finished, the old man reached for the notebook and opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Before we begin," Sullivan said, his voice carrying surprising authority despite its quietness, "understand that what I'm sharing comes from experience, not theory. Not everything I know appears in manuals, and some of it contradicts what you've been taught." He looked at each Marine in turn. "Question what I say if you need to, but do it respectfully and with purpose." The Marines nodded their understanding, and Reynolds felt a surge of pride in their professional demeanor. Sullivan began by unwrapping the first pistol, an immaculately maintained Browning high power that looked as if it had just left the factory, despite being at least 40 years old. "Combat shooting isn't about speed or style," Sullivan said, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he checked the weapon. "It's about survival, yours and your team's." He held up the pistol, demonstrating a grip that looked slightly unorthodox by modern standards. This was standard in '72, worked then, still works now, but there are better methods developed since. For the next hour, Sullivan took them through the evolution of combat handgun techniques, demonstrating how methods had changed over decades of refinement. He spoke little, showing rather than telling, occasionally having one of the Marines demonstrate a technique while he made subtle adjustments to their form. What impressed Reynolds most wasn't Sullivan's technical knowledge, though that was exceptional, but the way he explained the why behind each method. He didn't just show them how to shoot. He helped them understand the principles that governed effective combat marksmanship. "Your weapon is a tool, not a talisman," Sullivan told them as he demonstrated a reload technique that seemed impossibly smooth. "Won't save you if you think it's magic. Won't fail you if you respect its limitations." He looked up, his steel gray, eyes intense. "Most important weapon you have is this." He tapped his temple. "Everything else is just hardware." Reynolds watched his Marines absorb this wisdom, their expressions shifting from curiosity to genuine appreciation. Even Sergeant Wilson, the most experienced of the group, was taking mental notes, his usual skepticism replaced by attentive respect. After covering the basics of stance, grip, and trigger control, Sullivan paused, taking a sip from his ever-present thermos. The Marines remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Questions so far?" Sullivan asked, glancing around the semicircle. Corporal Jackson, the designated marksman, cleared his throat. "Sir, I noticed you shift your weight slightly forward before each shot. Is that intentional or just habit?" Sullivan's expression didn't change, but Reynolds caught the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. "Good observation, Corporal. It's deliberate, helps manage recoil and maintains target acquisition for follow-up shots." He demonstrated the technique again, this time exaggerating the movement slightly for clarity. "Developed that in Mozambique, '76. Had to make 8 shots count with no chance for a reload." The casual reference to what must have been an intense combat situation hung in the air for a moment. Reynolds knew better than to ask for details, and he was relieved when his Marines showed similar restraint. Sullivan reached for the wooden box next, opening it carefully to reveal a collection of what appeared to be handmade tools, specialized instruments for weapon maintenance that Reynolds had never seen before. "Standard cleaning kits are fine. And for garrison," Sullivan explained, removing a strange-looking device with an adjustable brass head. "These are for when standard isn't enough." He handed the tool to Corporal Hernandez, who examined it with obvious appreciation. "Made that after 3 days in a sandstorm outside Kabul. Regular extractors kept failing. This cleans places most tools can't reach." For the next 30 minutes, Sullivan showed them maintenance techniques that weren't in any manual. Methods developed through necessity in environments where weapon failure meant death. The Marines passed the specialized tools among themselves, asking questions that Sullivan answered with increasing openness, seemingly appreciative of their genuine interest. "Sir," PFC Chen asked during a pause, "if you don't mind my asking, how many different countries did you operate in?" Sullivan considered the question, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. "Officially none. Sierra Unit was never in-country anywhere." He reached for his thermos again. "Unofficially, 27 nations across 5 continents. Some don't exist anymore, at least not with the same names or borders." The Marines exchanged glances, the significance of this statement not lost on any of them. Sullivan had operated during the height of the Cold War, in places where American military presence would have constituted an international incident. "Most valuable lesson I learned," Sullivan continued, unprompted, "wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about people." He looked at each Marine in turn. "You can predict weapon functionality based on physics. You can predict enemy movements based on doctrine. But the human element, that's what decides most operations, one way or another." Reynolds noticed a change in Sullivan's demeanor, a subtle shift from instructor to mentor. The old operator was opening up, not about classified details of past missions, but about the philosophy that had guided his service and presumably kept him alive through decades of high-risk operations. "In '79, Sullivan said, his voice taking on a storytelling quality that captivated his audience, "I was in a situation where everything went wrong. Communication lost, extraction compromised, team separated." He rolled up his sleeve slightly, revealing a thin scar that ran from his wrist halfway to his elbow. Could have fallen apart completely. The Marines leaned in slightly, drawn into the narrative despite themselves. "What saved us wasn't our weapons or our training, though both helped. It was understanding the psychology of our situation." Sullivan's eyes seemed to focus on something distant. "The enemy thinks in patterns. Break those patterns, create confusion, and you create opportunity." He described, in carefully non-specific terms, how his team had used psychological tactics to divide and disorient a numerically superior force, ultimately completing their mission and extracting without casualties despite overwhelming odds. "Combat isn't just physical," he concluded. "It's mental, psychological, spiritual even, though that's not a word we used much in those days." Reynolds watched his Marines absorb this wisdom, seeing in their expressions the same respect he felt growing in himself. Sullivan wasn't just teaching them techniques. He was sharing a philosophy of survival and effectiveness that transcended any specific battlefield or era. The session continued for another hour, with Sullivan gradually shifting from weapons handling to broader tactical concepts. He never discussed specific operations or locations, but he illustrated principles with thinly veiled scenarios that gave the Marines insight into the kind of missions Sierra Unit had undertaken. What struck Reynolds most was Sullivan's emphasis on adaptability. "Standard operating procedures exist for a reason," he told them, "but the operator who can't think beyond doctrine won't survive when the situation demands innovation." As the morning progressed, Sullivan seemed to shed years before their eyes. His movements became more fluid, his voice more commanding, as if the act of teaching had reconnected him with a part of himself long dormant. He demonstrated hand-to-hand techniques that none of the Marines had seen before. Efficient, brutal methods designed not for competition, but for survival. "These weren't developed in dojos," Sullivan explained as he showed them a particularly effective counter to a knife attack. "They evolved from necessity, often from failure. Every technique I'm showing you was refined by blood." The sobering statement hung in the air, a reminder of the real-world consequences that had shaped Sullivan's knowledge. Reynolds noted that his Marines handled this information with appropriate gravity, their earlier excitement tempered by a growing appreciation for the hard-earned wisdom being shared with them. Around noon, Sullivan checked his watch, a simple, analog timepiece with a worn leather strap, and began methodically repacking his equipment. The Marines helped without being asked, handling his specialized tools and weapons with careful respect. "That's enough for today," Sullivan said, zipping his range bag with finality. "Apply what makes sense for your circumstances, discard what doesn't, but understand the principles behind everything." Reynolds stepped forward. "Sir, this has been invaluable. Thank you." Sullivan nodded once, accepting the gratitude without comment. As he prepared to leave, Lance Corporal Diaz spoke up unexpectedly. "Mr. Sullivan, sir," he said, his usual confidence replaced by respectful hesitation, "would you consider, would it be possible to do this again sometime?" The question hung in the air as Sullivan paused, his range bag halfway to his shoulder. For a long moment he didn't respond, and Reynolds feared the young Marine had overstepped. Then, with a deliberate motion, Sullivan reached into his pocket and removed what appeared to be a business card, though Reynolds suspected it was the first and only one Sullivan had ever carried. He handed it to Diaz without expression. "My cabin, next Saturday, 0700, Sullivan said simply. "Bring your full kit. We'll work on fieldcraft." The surprise was evident on Diaz's face, mirrored by the other Marines. Reynolds felt it himself. Sullivan was intensely private, yet he had just invited them to his home for additional training. The significance wasn't lost on any of them. As Sullivan turned to leave, Reynolds noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small pin on the underside of the old operator's collar, visible only when he turned his head at a particular angle. It was the insignia of a unit that even Reynolds, with his intelligence background, had only heard rumors about. Task Force Blue Spear, a joint CIA military operation that had reportedly been responsible for some of the most sensitive missions of the late Cold War. Sullivan must have sensed Reynolds' recognition because he met the staff sergeant's eyes with a look that conveyed both warning and understanding. Some secrets would remain just that, secrets. Reynolds gave an almost imperceptible nod, communicating his respect for those boundaries. With a final nod to the group, Sullivan walked out, his footsteps still remarkably silent despite his age. The Marines watched him go with expressions ranging from awe to thoughtful reflection. "Staff Sergeant," Sergeant Wilson said quietly when Sullivan was gone. "Who exactly was that?" Reynolds considered his answer carefully. "That, Sergeant Wilson, was a living piece of our nation's hidden history, a man who did things most people don't know needed doing, in places our country never officially went. He moves like no one I've ever seen," PFC Chen added. "Even the Force Recon guys don't have that kind of, I don't know what to call it." "Presence," Corporal Hernandez supplied, "like he's aware of everything around him without trying." Reynolds nodded. "That comes from decades of operating in environments where a single mistake meant death, not just for him, but for his team, and sometimes for people who would never know he was there to protect them." The Marines fell silent, processing this information and the experience they'd just shared. Reynolds allowed the moment to stretch, recognizing its value for his young warriors. In an age of social media operators and tactical influencers, meeting someone like Sullivan, who had done extraordinary things without seeking recognition, was a powerful counterbalance to the self-promotion that had infected even military culture. "What do we do with this?" Lance Corporal Diaz asked finally, holding up the simple card Sullivan had given him. It contained only an address, no name, no phone number. "You show up on Saturday," Reynolds replied. "On time, prepared, and with your mind open. And you treat Whatever he shares with you as the gift it is." Diaz nodded, tucking the card carefully into his wallet. "Yes, Staff Sergeant." As they packed up their gear and prepared to leave, Reynolds found himself lingering in the lane where Sullivan had conducted his impromptu seminar. Something about the old operator had affected him deeply. Not just the skills he'd demonstrated or the knowledge he'd shared, but the philosophy behind it all. The understanding that true mastery wasn't about ego or recognition, but about service rendered in obscurity, excellence pursued for its own sake. The rangemaster approached as Reynolds was finishing his notes. "Looked like quite a session," he commented, glancing at the targets Sullivan had used for demonstration. "Never seen shooting like that, and I've been around some serious operators." Reynolds nodded. It was educational. "He say anything about himself? Been wondering about that guy for 3 years now." Reynolds considered his response carefully. "Just enough to confirm what I suspected. He's someone who served when things were different, when certain units didn't exist on paper, and certain operations never happened officially." "The range." Master's eyebrows rose slightly. "Cold War stuff, huh?" "The coldest," Reynolds confirmed. "The kind where you're completely on your own if things go wrong, and no one ever knows what you did if things go right." The rangemaster let out a low whistle. "Explains a lot. Way he moves, way he shoots. Always figured he had some kind of background, but nothing like that." Reynolds gathered his notes, tucking them into his waterproof pouch. "Some of the best never talk about what they did. It's the ones who never shut up about their service you have to wonder about." "Ain't that the truth?" The rangemaster agreed with a knowing chuckle. "You guys coming back for more?" "Not here," Reynolds replied. "He's invited a few of my Marines to his place on Saturday for additional training." The rangemaster's surprise was evident. "No kidding? Man's never said more than 10 words to anyone here, and now he's hosting training sessions? You must have made quite an impression." Reynolds shook his head. "Not me. My Marines did." He recognized something in them worth investing in. As Reynolds walked to his vehicle, the rain had stopped, leaving behind that unique after-storm clarity that made colors more vivid and sounds more distinct. He found himself thinking about Sullivan's words regarding adaptation and innovation, how the best operators weren't those who followed procedures blindly, but those who understood the principles behind them deeply enough to improvise when necessary. It was a philosophy that applied beyond the battlefield, Reynolds realized, a way of approaching life itself, understanding fundamentals so thoroughly that you could adapt to any situation with confidence and competence. His Marines were waiting by their vehicles, still discussing the morning's session with animated gestures and expressions of wonder. Reynolds felt a surge of pride in their professionalism and their eagerness to learn. They had shown Sullivan the respect he deserved, and in return he had offered them something precious, wisdom that couldn't be found in any manual or training program. "Staff Sergeant," Corporal Jackson called as Reynolds approached. "We were just talking. Do you think any of Mr. Sullivan's operations are declassified now? Maybe we could research some of them, understand the context better." Reynolds shook his head. "Some operations never get declassified, Corporal. They remain in the shadows permanently, not because the threat still exists, but because acknowledging them would create more problems than it would solve." "So no one will ever know what he did?" PFC Chen asked, sounding troubled by the concept. "The people who needed to know knew," Reynolds replied. "And the people who mattered to him, his teammates, his handlers, the few who authorized those missions, they knew too. Beyond that?" He shrugged. "Some service is rendered in silence. That doesn't make it less valuable." The Marines nodded, accepting this reality with varying degrees of understanding. They were young, still in a world where recognition and advancement were natural goals. The concept of serving without acknowledgement, of excellence pursued in obscurity, was foreign to most of them. But Reynolds saw in their expressions that Sullivan had planted a seed, a recognition that there was something noble in quiet competence, something worthy of respect in those who did extraordinary things without seeking the spotlight. As they prepared to depart, Reynolds found himself looking toward the mountains where Sullivan's cabin presumably stood. What other wisdom might the old operator share? What hard-earned lessons from decades of classified operations might benefit a new generation of warriors? Saturday would tell. For now, Reynolds was simply grateful for the glimpse they'd been given into a world few ever saw, the shadowy realm of operations that changed history without ever appearing in its pages. On the drive back to base, Reynolds found himself reflecting on Sullivan's words about the human element being the decisive factor in most operations. It wasn't just true in combat, it was true in all aspects of life. Technology evolved, weapons, systems advanced, but the fundamental realities of human psychology, courage, fear, trust, betrayal, those remained constants across time. Perhaps that was Sullivan's most valuable lesson, that beyond the techniques and tactics, beyond the specialized tools and weapons, it was the human qualities that mattered most. The discipline to train relentlessly, the courage to act decisively, the wisdom to know when to engage and when to withdraw, the integrity to do what was right, even when no one would ever know. These were the qualities Sullivan embodied, not through words or claims, but through the quiet dignity of his presence. A lifetime of service rendered in silence had shaped him into something rare, a warrior without ego, an operator without audience, a man who had done extraordinary things and felt no need to tell the world about them. In an age of constant self-promotion and curated online personas, Sullivan represented something increasingly rare, authentic excellence pursued not for recognition, but for its own sake. Service rendered not for accolades, but because it needed to be done. As Reynolds pulled into the base, he made a decision. He would join his Marines on Saturday, not to supervise or intervene, but to learn alongside them. Because men like Sullivan were vanishing treasures, living libraries of knowledge and wisdom that couldn't be found in books or training manuals. And some lessons could only be learned from those who had lived them. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy mist shrouding the mountains, turning the winding forest road into a ghostly passage between worlds. Staff Sergeant Reynolds led the small convoy of 3 vehicles, following the GPS coordinates he'd extracted from the address on Sullivan's card. As they climbed higher into the foothills, cell service faded to nothing, and the paved road gave way to gravel, then to hard-packed dirt that wound between towering pines. "He really doesn't want visitors, does he?" Corporal Jackson muttered from the passenger seat, peering through the fog at the increasingly rugged terrain. Reynolds didn't answer immediately, his attention focused on navigating a particularly steep switchback. "Men who've lived certain kinds of lives value their privacy," he said finally. "It's not about being antisocial, it's about security becoming second nature." The convoy continued upward for another 20 minutes, the forest growing denser around them. Just as Reynolds was beginning to wonder if they'd missed a turn, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. At its center stood a cabin that defied expectations. Reynolds had imagined something rustic and rough-hewn, a hermit's retreat. What they found instead was a meticulously designed structure that blended almost seamlessly with its surroundings. The cabin was constructed of local timber and stone, with a metal roof that matched the color of the surrounding granite. Solar panels were discreetly positioned to catch the morning sun, and a small wind turbine spun lazily on a ridge behind the building. Most striking was the cabin's positioning. It offered clear sight lines in all directions while remaining partially concealed by natural features. A tactician's home, designed by someone who understood both aesthetics and security. Sullivan was waiting for them on the covered porch, seated in a handcrafted wooden chair with his ever-present thermos beside him. He wore the same style of clothing they'd seen at the range, practical, durable garments in muted earth tones, but somehow he looked more at ease here, more connected to his surroundings. The Marines parked their vehicles in the designated area and gathered their gear with practiced efficiency. Reynolds noted with approval that they'd followed his instructions precisely. Full combat loadout minus weapons, which Sullivan had specified they should not bring. Instead, they carried their standard field equipment, packs, communications gear, navigation tools, and survival essentials. Sullivan watched their approach without expression, those steel-grey eyes missing nothing. When they reached the porch, he stood with a fluid motion that belied his age. "On time," he noted, glancing at his watch. "Good." His gaze shifted to Reynolds. "Didn't expect you, Staff Sergeant." Reynolds straightened slightly. "Hoping I'm not intruding, sir. Thought I might learn something alongside my Marines." Sullivan studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod of acceptance. "Coffee inside. We'll brief, then move out." Without waiting for a response, he turned and entered the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. The Marines exchanged glances, then followed, removing their boots at the threshold without being asked, a sign of respect that Reynolds suspected would not go unnoticed. The interior of the cabin was a revelation. Clean lines and functional. Design dominated the open floor plan, but what caught Reynolds' attention immediately were the walls. One entire section was covered with topographical maps of various regions, some recognizable, others so obscure that Reynolds couldn't place them. Another wall held a collection of framed black and white photographs, all landscapes or buildings, notably devoid of people. The furniture was handcrafted but elegant, each piece designed for both comfort and durability. A wood stove occupied one corner, its iron surface gleaming from regular maintenance. Beside it stood a neat stack of split logs, arranged with the same precision Sullivan brought to everything else. Most telling was the complete absence of clutter. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose. It was the home of a man who had spent his life eliminating variables and controlling his environment. Sullivan gestured toward a large wooden table where 7 mugs of steaming coffee waited. "Help yourselves," he said, moving to a topographical map that had been unrolled and weighted at the corners. The Marines approached the table, each taking a mug, with murmured thanks. Reynolds noticed that Sullivan had prepared the coffee exactly as each Marine preferred it. Black for Wilson, cream for Chen, sugar for the others. A small detail that spoke volumes about his observational skills. "Today isn't about weapons," Sullivan began without preamble, his voice carrying that same quiet authority they'd heard at the range. "It's about fieldcraft, survival, movement, awareness." He tapped the map, which Reynolds now recognized as a detailed representation of the surrounding mountains. 10-mile circuit, several terrain types, natural challenges, a few I've arranged. The Marines gathered around the map, their expressions focused as Sullivan outlined the day's training evolution. It wasn't a casual hike. It was a carefully designed course that would test their navigation skills, environmental awareness, and physical endurance. "Work as a team," Sullivan instructed, making eye contact with each Marine in turn. "But each of you has a specific role." He assigned responsibilities with the precision of someone who had planned countless operations. Wilson on point navigation, Hernandez on security, Diaz on terrain analysis, Jackson on communication protocols, Chen on medical and sustainment. Reynolds he designated as observer, a role that suited the staff sergeant's purpose in coming, not to lead or interfere, but to watch and learn alongside his Marines. "Questions?" Sullivan asked when he'd finished the briefing. Corporal Hernandez raised a hand. "Sir, you mentioned challenges you've arranged. What should we expect?" Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but something like approval flickered in his eyes. "Good question. Expect the unexpected. That's all you get." He checked his watch. "Again! Gear up! We move in 5. The Marines finished their coffee and prepared their equipment with practiced efficiency. Reynolds watched Sullivan during this process, noting how the old operator's eyes missed nothing. Each adjustment, each equipment check, each interaction between team members. 5 minutes later, they stood outside the cabin, ready to move out. Sullivan had added only a small pack to his attire, its contents unknown, but almost certainly carefully selected for the day's activities. "First principle of fieldcraft," Sullivan said as they prepared to depart, "is understanding your environment, not just seeing it, reading it." He gestured to the forest around them. "Everything out here tells a story. Direction of moss growth, pattern of bird calls, texture of the soil. Learn to read these signs, and the wilderness becomes an open book." With that, he set off along a nearly invisible trail that led away from the clearing, moving with that same silent efficiency they'd observed at the range. The Marines followed, with Reynolds bringing up the rear, his senses already heightened by Sullivan's words. The first hour passed in relative silence as they established a rhythm, Sullivan setting a pace that was challenging but sustainable. The terrain varied from dense forest to rocky outcroppings, each transition requiring subtle adjustments in movement technique and awareness. Occasionally, Sullivan would stop and point out something the Marines might have missed, a disturbed patch of ground indicating recent animal activity, a slight discoloration in the bark of a tree signaling disease, a particular formation of clouds that suggested weather changes to come. "Second principle," Sullivan said during one such pause, "is economy of movement. Every step costs energy. Every sound creates signature. Move deliberately, efficiently, with purpose." He demonstrated a technique for traversing rocky ground that minimized both noise and energy expenditure, a method Reynolds had never seen taught in any military course. The Marines absorbed these lessons eagerly, adapting their movements to incorporate Sullivan's guidance. Reynolds observed with growing appreciation how the old operator didn't just tell them what to do, he showed them, then watched as they implemented, offering corrections with that same quiet precision that characterized everything about him. Around mid-morning, they encountered the first of Sullivan's arranged challenges, a ravine crossing where the obvious path had been subtly altered to create a false trail that led to an unstable section of ground. "Stop," Sullivan said quietly, as Lance Corporal Diaz was about to take the bait. "What do you see?" Diaz hesitated, scanning the area with newfound intensity. "The trail. It's too convenient," he said after a moment. "And those broken branches, they're fresh cuts, not natural breaks." Sullivan nodded once. "Manufactured evidence, the enemy's favorite trick." He pointed to a less obvious route that provided more secure footing. "Always question the easy path." This pattern continued throughout the morning, Sullivan presenting challenges that tested not just the Marines' physical abilities, but their perception and critical thinking. A water crossing that required careful weight distribution, a dense thicket that concealed the actual trail, a rocky ascent where the apparent handholds were deliberately unstable. With each challenge, the Marines grew more attuned to Sullivan's teaching style, the way he provided just enough guidance to point them in the right direction, then stepped back to let them solve the problem themselves. It was masterful instruction, Reynolds realized. Not spoon-feeding information, but cultivating the ability to think independently in demanding circumstances. By midday, they had covered nearly 5 miles of challenging terrain. Sullivan called a halt in a small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream. 30 minutes, he announced. Rehydrate, refuel. The Marines established a small perimeter by unspoken agreement, a testament to their training and growing cohesion as a team. Sullivan observed this with silent approval, then moved to sit on a fallen log, extracting a simple meal from his pack: jerky, dried fruit, and what appeared to be homemade bread. Reynolds joined him after checking on his Marines. "Your land?" he asked, gesturing to the surrounding wilderness. Sullivan nodded. 80 acres. Bought it after retiring. Needed space. He took a sip from his canteen. Silence, too. "Well, it's impressive terrain for training," Reynolds commented. "Varied, challenging." "Wasn't thinking about training when I bought it," Sullivan replied. "Just wanted somewhere apart." He looked around at the Marines, who were maintaining security while eating their field rations. "Never thought I'd be bringing others up here." There was something in his tone that caught Reynolds' attention. Not regret, exactly, but a hint of reflection, as if Sullivan himself was surprised by his decision to share this private domain. "What changed?" Reynolds asked carefully, aware he might be overstepping. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he said, "Getting old makes you think about legacy, not medals or mentions, knowledge." He nodded toward the Marines. "They have potential. Hate to see good lessons die with old men." The simple statement carried profound weight. Reynolds understood what wasn't being said, that Sullivan, who had spent decades operating in complete secrecy, was confronting his own mortality and the knowledge that would disappear with him if not passed on. "They appreciate it more than they can express," Reynolds said quietly. "This kind of mentorship is rare." Sullivan gave a slight shrug, uncomfortable with even this modest acknowledgement. "Third principle of fieldcraft," he said, clearly changing the subject. "Adaptability. Plan thoroughly, but be prepared to abandon the plan entirely." Reynolds recognized the deflection but respected it. Sullivan wasn't seeking gratitude or recognition. He never had been. The teaching itself was what mattered to him. After the brief rest, they continued the circuit, the terrain growing more challenging as they ascended higher into the mountains. Sullivan's arranged challenges became more complex as well, scenarios that required the Marines to combine their skills and work as a coordinated team. One particularly ingenious test involved a compromised trail where Sullivan had carefully placed subtle indicators of an ambush. The Marines spotted most, but not all of these signs, enough to alter their route, but not enough to avoid walking into the heart of the trap. Sullivan allowed the scenario to play out fully, using small paint markers to indicate simulated fire. When the ambush was complete, he gathered the Marines for a debrief that was direct, but not demeaning. "You saw the obvious," he told them, pointing out the indicators they'd noticed, missed the subtle. He showed them the signs they'd overlooked: patterns of disturbed vegetation, unnatural shadows, slight color discrepancies that the human eye tends to dismiss, but the trained observer recognizes as warnings. "In my line," Sullivan said, his voice taking on that storytelling quality they'd heard briefly at the range. "Missing these details meant failure, often permanent." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. The implication was clear. In the world of clandestine operations, mistakes were frequently fatal. "How do you develop that level of awareness?" PFC Chen asked, clearly frustrated by what they'd missed. Sullivan's response was unexpected. "Start with beauty," he said. "Most people walk through the world half blind, missing details because they're focused on themselves. Learn to appreciate your surroundings, really see them, and the warning signs become apparent." It was a profound observation, Reynolds thought. Not tactical advice, but a philosophical approach to perception that transcended military applications. The afternoon continued with escalating challenges, each designed to push the Marines beyond their comfort zones while teaching specific skills. Sullivan demonstrated techniques for moving silently across various terrain types, methods for concealment using natural materials, and approaches to navigation when traditional tools were unavailable. What impressed Reynolds most was how Sullivan connected each practical skill to broader principles. He wasn't just showing them how to do things, he was teaching them how to think. Fourth principle, Sullivan told them during a brief pause atop a ridge that offered breathtaking views of the valley below, is situational awareness. Not just what's happening now, but what might happen next. He pointed to a distant weather information. Those clouds mean weather changing in 3 hours. That bird pattern indicates a predator nearby. That broken branch suggests someone else has been here recently. The Marines absorbed these insights with growing appreciation. Their initial awe of Sullivan's background now transformed into respect for his knowledge and teaching ability. As the day progressed, Reynolds noticed a subtle change in Sullivan's demeanor. The carefully maintained distance he'd established at first was gradually diminishing. He still didn't smile much, still kept his instructions concise, but there was an increasing warmth in his interactions. Small moments of connection as he worked with each Marine individually on specific skills. By late afternoon, they had completed nearly 8 miles of the planned circuit, with the most challenging sections still ahead, a steep ravine crossing followed by a technical ascent that would test their endurance and newly acquired skills. Sullivan paused before they began this final phase, gathering the Marines around him. "What we're about to do would normally require specialized equipment," he said, gesturing to the imposing terrain ahead. "We'll do it with what we have. This isn't about physical capability, it's about problem-solving under pressure." He outlined the challenge. They would need to descend into the ravine, cross a fast-moving stream, then ascend the opposite side, all while maintaining security and team integrity. The direct route was clearly impassable. They would need to find an alternative approach. "Take 5 minutes," Sullivan instructed. "Develop a plan as a team. I'll observe." Reynolds watched with pride as his Marines immediately began analyzing the problem, drawing on the lessons they'd learned throughout the day. Sergeant Wilson took point on planning, but he actively solicited input from each team member, recognizing their individual strengths. Sullivan observed this process with undisguised interest, his eyes tracking not just what they said, but how they interacted, the group dynamics, the decision-making process, the balance between assertiveness and receptivity. When the 5 minutes were up, Lance Corporal Diaz presented their plan, a thoughtful approach that incorporated natural features for security and movement, contingencies for potential complications, and clear roles for each team member. Sullivan listened without interruption, then simply nodded. "Execute," he said. What followed was the most demanding hour of the entire day. The Marines implemented their plan with determination and growing confidence, adapting as they encountered unexpected challenges. The stream proved faster than anticipated. They adjusted. The ascent revealed unstable sections. They found alternatives. Throughout the evolution, Sullivan maintained a watchful presence, intervening only once when PFC Chen encountered a genuinely dangerous situation on the ascent. His assistance was efficient and egoless, a hand extended at precisely the right moment, a quiet word of guidance, then a step back to allow Chen to continue independently. When they finally reached the top of the opposite ridge, sweaty and breathing hard but successful, Sullivan did something they hadn't seen before. He smiled. It was brief, just a slight upward turn of his mouth, but in the context of his usual stoicism, it was significant. "Well executed," he said simply. "You learned fast." Coming from Sullivan, it was high praise indeed. The Marines exchanged glances of tired satisfaction, recognizing the milestone this represented. The final mile back to Sullivan's cabin was less physically demanding, but no less instructive. As they walked, Sullivan shared observations about their performance, not just what they'd done well, but specific areas for improvement. His feedback was direct but constructive, focused on growth rather than criticism. Final principle of fieldcraft, he told them as the cabin came into view through the trees, is humility. Nature doesn't care about your rank or your ego. Neither does the enemy. Learn from every experience, especially failures. Reynolds reflected on this wisdom, recognizing its application beyond the military context. Sullivan's principles weren't just about survival in hostile environments. They were about moving through the world with awareness, purpose, and continuous growth. As they arrived back at the clearing, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cabin and surrounding forest. Sullivan led them to a fire pit area where wood had been carefully stacked in preparation. "Clean up, then we'll talk," he instructed, pointing toward a small outbuilding that presumably contained washing facilities. 30 minutes later, refreshed and changed into dry clothes, the Marines gathered around a small but efficient fire that Sullivan had built. The atmosphere was different now, more relaxed, the formality of the training evolution giving way to a sense of shared accomplishment. Sullivan had prepared a simple meal, venison stew that had apparently been slow cooking all day, bread that smelled freshly baked, and strong black coffee. He served each of them without ceremony, then took his own seat across the fire. As they ate, the silence was comfortable rather than strained. Reynolds observed how his Marines had changed over the course of a single day, their movements more deliberate, their awareness of their surroundings heightened, their interactions with each other more seamless. When the meal was finished, Sullivan set his bowl aside and looked into the fire for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had a different quality, reflective, almost intimate. "You asked at the range about Sierra Unit," he said, addressing Reynolds directly. "What it was, what we did." Reynolds felt the Marines grow still, their attention sharpening. Sullivan had consistently deflected questions about his operational history. This voluntary opening was unexpected. "I can't tell you specifics," Sullivan continued. "Some things stay classified forever, but I can tell you this. We were ghosts. We went where others couldn't go, did what needed doing, then disappeared without leaving traces." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkening sky. 23 years, 14 countries, missions that never officially happened, some good work, some necessary work, some I still think about at night. The Marines listened in respectful silence, understanding the rarity of what they were witnessing, a man who had operated in complete secrecy for decades, sharing even this limited glimpse into his service. "Why tell us now?" Corporal Hernandez asked quietly. Sullivan considered the question, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing firelight. "Because what matters isn't the operations," he said finally. "It's the principles behind them, the ethos, the understanding that some service happens in shadows, unrecognized, uncelebrated, but still essential." He looked at each Marine in turn, his gaze intense. Worlds changing, technology, politics, threats, but certain truths remain constant. The need for men and women who can think independently, who can operate when everything goes wrong, who understand that the mission matters more than recognition. Reynolds felt the weight of these words settle on his Marines, a challenge and a legacy being passed to a new generation. Sullivan wasn't sharing war stories. He was transmitting a philosophy that had guided his service through decades of clandestine operations. The quietest operators, Sullivan continued, were always the most effective, not because they had the most kills or the most missions, but because they understood proportion, precision, purpose. He glanced at Reynolds. Your Marines have that potential, raw, still developing, but there. The compliment, delivered in Sullivan's characteristically understated manner, carried immense significance. Reynolds saw his Marines straighten slightly, the responsibility of Sullivan's assessment settling on their shoulders. As the fire burned lower and the night deepened around them, Sullivan shared a few carefully selected anecdotes, never revealing classified details, but illustrating the principles he'd taught them throughout the day with real-world examples. A navigation challenge in a hostile environment where conventional tools were unavailable, a terrain problem that required innovative thinking under extreme pressure, a situation where awareness of subtle environmental cues had meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Through these stories, the Marines gained insights not just into Sullivan's extraordinary career, but into the mindset that had guided him through decades of high-risk operations, the disciplined approach to challenges, the egoless problem-solving, the continuous learning and adaptation. As the evening drew to a close, Lance Corporal Diaz asked the question that had been on all their minds. "Will you train with us again, sir?" Sullivan didn't answer immediately. He studied the dying embers of the fire, his expression thoughtful. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew what appeared to be 7 small objects, which he placed on a flat stone beside the fire pit. "For each of you," he said simply. Reynolds leaned closer to see what Sullivan had offered. They were challenge coins, but unlike any he'd seen before. Simple, unmarked except for a single symbol on one side, the Sierra unit insignia, and a phrase on the other: silence, service, shadows. "These don't officially exist," Sullivan said quietly. "Neither did we." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on any of them. Challenge coins were a military tradition, tokens of recognition and belonging. But these weren't ordinary coins. They represented inclusion in something that had remained hidden for decades, an acknowledgement of worthiness that Sullivan clearly didn't bestow lightly. "As for training," Sullivan continued, answering Diaz's question at last, "yes, monthly. Here, if you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach." The Marines exchanged glances of barely contained excitement, which they quickly tempered out of respect for Sullivan's reserved demeanor. Reynolds felt a surge of pride, not just in his Marines, but in Sullivan's recognition of their potential. As they prepared to depart, gathering their gear and dousing the remnants of the fire, Sullivan pulled Reynolds aside briefly. "They've got good foundations," he said, nodding toward the Marines, "but they need what can't be taught in courses: judgment, perspective, the wisdom to know when to act and when to wait." Reynolds nodded his understanding. "That's why this means so much. They can learn tactics anywhere. What you're offering is something rarer." Sullivan acknowledged this with a slight incline of his head. "Next session, bring their service weapons. Time to see if they can apply today's lessons under stress." "We'll be ready," Reynolds assured him. As they walked toward their vehicles, Sullivan remained on the porch, a solitary figure silhouetted against the warm light from within the cabin. Reynolds glanced back once, struck by the contradiction of the man, isolated yet now connected, secretive yet sharing, apparently self-sufficient yet reaching out to a new generation. In that moment, Reynolds understood something profound about Sullivan and men like him. Their strength wasn't in their isolation or their secrecy. It was in their capacity to carry knowledge and experience that few would ever understand, and their willingness, when the time was right, to pass that legacy forward. As the convoy of vehicles wound its way back down the mountain road, Reynolds felt a sense of privilege that transcended his rank or position. They had been granted access not just to Sullivan's domain, but to a philosophy of service and excellence that had guided one of the nation's most secretive operators through decades of hidden missions. And in doing so, Sullivan had ensured that what mattered most, not the classified details of past operations, but the principles that had made them successful, would survive to guide a new generation of warriors facing challenges he could only imagine. 3 months passed, seasons shifting from late spring to the full bloom of summer. The training sessions with Sullivan had become a sacred ritual for Reynolds and his Marines. One Saturday each month, dawn till dusk, lessons that transcended conventional military instruction and ventured into the realm of wisdom that could only be gained through decades of high-stakes experience. What began as a chance encounter at a shooting range had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated, an intergenerational transfer of knowledge that went far beyond tactics and techniques. Sullivan was teaching them not just how to operate, but how to think, how to perceive, how to embody the quiet excellence that had defined his extraordinary career. Word had spread within certain circles about the veteran operator who was mentoring a select group of Marines. A few, others had asked to join, some respectfully, others with the entitled attitude of those who believed their rank or reputation guaranteed access. Reynolds had deflected these requests, protecting the sacred space Sullivan had created. This wasn't about exclusivity, it was about preserving the integrity of what was being shared. On this particular Saturday, their 4th session with Sullivan, Reynolds noticed something different as they arrived at the cabin. Parked beside Sullivan's faded blue Ford was a black government SUV with tinted windows and government plates. The Marines exchanged concerned glances as they pulled into the clearing. Sullivan stood on the porch as usual, but he wasn't alone. Beside him was a man in his 50s, trim and fit, wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite disguise his military bearing. His silver hair was cut short, and his posture spoke of command. "That's General Clark," Sergeant Wilson whispered, recognition and surprise in his voice. "Former JSOC commander." Reynolds felt a moment of apprehension. General William Clark was indeed a legend in Special Operations circles, a former commander of Joint Special Operations Command, who had overseen some of the most sensitive missions of the post-9/11 era before retiring to a senior advisory position that few could define precisely. His presence here was unexpected and potentially concerning. As the Marines approached the cabin, Sullivan stepped forward. "Change of plans today," he said without preamble. "General Clark has some things to discuss." The general stepped forward, studying the Marines with penetrating blue eyes. "At ease," he said, his voice carrying natural authority. "This isn't an official visit." Reynolds maintained a professional demeanor, but questions raced through his mind. Had someone reported their unofficial training sessions? Was Sullivan in some kind of trouble for sharing knowledge that might still be classified? "Let's talk." "Inside," Sullivan said, gesturing toward the cabin door. The Marines followed, an undercurrent of tension now running beneath their usual focused anticipation. Inside, the cabin looked the same as it had during their previous visits, meticulously organized, functional, a reflection of Sullivan's ordered mind. Coffee was already prepared, mugs set out in the same arrangement as before. General Clark took a position near the wood stove, watching as the Marines arranged themselves around the main room. Sullivan remained standing, his expression unreadable. "I'll be direct," Clark said once everyone was settled. "Your monthly sessions with Mr. Sullivan have attracted attention in certain quarters." Reynolds felt his spine stiffen. "Sir, if there's been a violation of protocol—" Clark raised a hand, cutting him off. "Relax, Staff Sergeant. You're not in trouble. Quite the opposite, in fact." He glanced at Sullivan, something like respect in his eyes. When Thomas Sullivan starts teaching again after 30 years of silence, people who understand his significance take notice. Sullivan's expression didn't change, but Reynolds detected a slight tension in his posture. The use of his first name and the familiar way Clark referred to him suggested a history between the two men, colleagues perhaps, or even former teammates. "General Clark and I served together," Sullivan confirmed, as if reading Reynolds's thoughts. "Different units, same theaters. He was an officer worth following." Coming from Sullivan, this was extraordinary praise. Reynolds reassessed the situation, realizing that this wasn't an intervention, but something else entirely. Clark nodded in acknowledgement of Sullivan's words. "What Tom isn't telling you is that he saved my life twice in circumstances that don't exist in any official record." He turned to the Marines. "I'm here because what's happening in this cabin matters. The knowledge being transferred here is invaluable, not just to you personally, but to the Corps and to the nation." Lance Corporal Diaz shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, are you saying our training needs to stop?" "Just the opposite, Marine," Clark replied. "I'm here to ensure it continues and expands in a way that protects everyone involved." Sullivan moved to the large wooden table, gesturing for everyone to join him. Once they were seated, he placed a folder on the table, simple, unmarked, but clearly official in nature. "What the General is proposing," Sullivan said, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm, "is formalization, limited, controlled, but official." Clark opened the folder, revealing documents bearing insignias that Reynolds recognized as belonging to the Special Operations Training Command. "I've established a specialized training initiative," Clark explained. "Officially, it's designated as Historical Tactics Integration Program, a bureaucratic title deliberately designed to sound boring." A slight smile crossed his face. "Unofficially, those who need to know call it the Sullivan Protocols." The Marines exchanged glances, the significance of this statement not lost on any of them. For a classified program to bear Sullivan's name represented an extraordinary acknowledgement of his contributions, a far cry from the anonymity that had characterized his active service. "The program creates a secure framework," Clark continued. "It provides authorization for what you're already doing, plus resources to expand if Sullivan is willing." He glanced at the older operator. "It also ensures that the knowledge being shared remains protected, classified at appropriate levels, shared only with those who have been properly vetted." Reynolds processed this information carefully. "Sir, what exactly would change about our current arrangement?" "Practically speaking, not much," Clark replied. "You'd continue your sessions here. Sullivan remains in complete control of what's taught and who participates. The main differences would be formal security protocols, documentation of certain aspects of the training, and the potential to incorporate elements that currently remain classified." Sullivan, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "This isn't what I had in mind when I started working with your Marines, Reynolds." His tone wasn't accusatory, just matter-of-fact. Wasn't looking to create a program or leave any kind of legacy. "I know, Tom," Clark said quietly. "That's exactly why it matters. The system is full of people trying to build empires and attach their names to initiatives. What you're doing here is different. Authentic, egoless transmission of hard-earned wisdom." He looked around at the Marines. "That's precisely what we're trying to preserve." Sullivan didn't respond immediately. He studied the documents on the table, his weathered hands resting lightly on the wood. Reynolds could almost see the internal debate playing out behind those steel-grey eyes, the instinct for privacy and independence wrestling with the pragmatic recognition of what Clark was offering. "There's something else you should know," Clark added, addressing the Marines directly. "What you've been learning here isn't just historically significant. It's immediately relevant to current operations." This caught everyone's attention. Sullivan looked up sharply. 3 months ago," Clark continued, "a special operations team in North Africa encountered a situation remarkably similar to one Sullivan faced in Libya in 1984. The modern team had all the technology and firepower our country could provide, but they lacked the specific fieldcraft Sullivan developed for operating in that environment. The mission succeeded, but with complications that were entirely preventable. Sullivan's expression darkened slightly. "You're talking about the Benghazi extraction?" Clark nodded. "Details are still classified, but yes, the parallels to your operation in '84 were striking." Reynolds watched this exchange with growing understanding. What had begun as informal mentorship now had tangible, practical implications for ongoing operations. The wisdom Sullivan was sharing wasn't just historically interesting, it was saving lives. "The point is," Clark said, addressing the whole group again, "what happens in this cabin isn't academic. It's not about preserving the past for its own sake. It's about ensuring that hard-earned lessons don't have to be relearned at the cost of American lives." Sullivan stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the forest surrounding his sanctuary. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally turned back, his expression had shifted subtly. Still reserved, still disciplined, but with a new resolve in his eyes. "I need to think about this," he said, not to Clark specifically, but to all of them. "Today's session continues as planned. We'll discuss the General's proposal afterward." Clark seemed to have expected this response. He gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. "Of course. I'll join as an observer, if that's acceptable." Sullivan gave a single nod, then moved toward the door. "Gear up. We're working on night navigation and surveillance detection today. Weather's turning by afternoon. Perfect conditions for the lessons." The Marines responded with practiced efficiency, gathering their equipment and preparing for what they knew would be a demanding day of instruction. As they moved about the cabin, Reynolds approached Sullivan briefly. "Sir, if you'd prefer we postpone today's session." Sullivan cut him off with a slight shake of his head. "Training continues, regardless of circumstances. First principle of operational resilience." There was the faintest hint of a smile in his eyes, though his expression remained serious. "Besides, the General could use some mud on those clean boots, remind him what field conditions feel like." Reynolds suppressed a smile of his own and nodded his understanding. As he turned to join his Marines, he caught Clark watching their interaction with what appeared to be satisfied approval. The day's training was even more intense than previous sessions. Sullivan led them through exercises in terrain navigation without conventional tools, demonstrating techniques for maintaining direction using natural indicators when technology failed. He taught them methods for detecting surveillance that had been developed during Cold War operations in denied environments, subtle awareness practices that no modern manual included. Most valuable were the counter-tracking techniques, ways to move through terrain without leaving discernible signs of passage. Sullivan demonstrated how to walk without disrupting ground cover, how to cross streams without leaving marks on the banks, how to traverse rocky areas without dislodging stones or disturbing the natural pattern of dust. Throughout these exercises, General Clark observed, without interfering, occasionally taking notes but mostly watching with the quiet appreciation of someone who understood the value of what was being shared. Reynolds noticed that despite his rank and age, Clark kept pace with the Marines, tackling the physical challenges with the determination of a man half his years. During a brief lunch break, Clark approached PFC Chen, who had demonstrated particular aptitude for the surveillance detection techniques Sullivan had taught that morning. "You have a good eye, Marine," Clark commented, his tone conversational rather than official. "Ever consider a career in intelligence operations?" Chen straightened slightly. "No, sir. Always wanted to be a grunt." Clark nodded, respecting the answer. "The best intelligence operators I've known started as infantrymen. They understand ground truth in a way analysts never do." He glanced toward Sullivan, who was discussing something with Corporal Jackson nearby. Sullivan was the best because he could think like both, tactical awareness combined with strategic perspective. This casual insight into Sullivan's operational approach was fascinating to Reynolds, who had overheard the exchange. It helped explain the older operator's effectiveness, his ability to connect immediate actions to broader objectives, to see both the details and the big picture simultaneously. The afternoon brought deteriorating weather, just as Sullivan had predicted. A steady rain began to fall, reducing visibility and creating challenging conditions for the exercises. Sullivan seemed pleased by this development, using the adverse environment to emphasize key points about adaptability and sensory compensation. When visibility drops, he instructed, as they navigated a particularly dense section of forest, other senses must heighten. Listen to how rain hits different surfaces, leaves versus soil versus stone. Feel changes in ground texture through your boots. Smell differences in vegetation and soil composition. Your body knows things your conscious mind doesn't yet understand. It was this kind of insight, bridging the physical and the intuitive, that made Sullivan's instructions so valuable. He wasn't just teaching techniques, he was helping the Marines develop a holistic awareness that transcended conventional training. By late afternoon, they were thoroughly soaked but energized by the day's lessons. Sullivan led them back to the cabin by a route that tested everything they'd learned, a complex path that required them to apply navigation, counter-tracking, and environmental awareness simultaneously. When they finally reached the clearing, Sullivan paused before entering the cabin. "Get cleaned up," he instructed. "Then we'll talk about the General's proposal." An hour later, dried and changed into clean clothes, they gathered around the large wooden table. The atmosphere was different from previous post-training discussions, more formal, the presence of General Clark adding an official dimension that hadn't existed before. Sullivan had prepared coffee and a simple meal of stew and bread, maintaining the tradition they'd established over previous sessions. As they ate, Clark remained respectfully silent, allowing Sullivan to lead the conversation at his own pace. Finally, when the meal was finished, Sullivan set his bowl aside and addressed the group. "I've considered the General's proposal," he said without preamble. "I have conditions." Clark nodded, unsurprised. "I expected nothing less." "First," Sullivan continued, "this remains my program. I decide what's taught, how it's taught, and who participates. No committees, no oversight boards, no bureaucratic interference." "Agreed," Clark said immediately. "You have complete autonomy over content and methods." "Second, this stays small. Quality over quantity. I'm not interested in processing hundreds of operators through some kind of assembly line. Each Marine I work with gets individual attention." Clark nodded again. "The proposal explicitly limits participation to 20 personnel maximum at any given time, with you having final approval of all candidates." "Third," Sullivan said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation, "no publicity, no articles in military journals, no press releases, no mention in briefings to Congress. What happens here stays contained within the community that needs to know." "That's built into the security protocols," Clark assured him. "The program exists on paper only as that bureaucratic title I mentioned. Your name appears nowhere in the unclassified documentation." Sullivan considered this for a moment, then continued. "Fourth, these Marines remain the core group." He gestured to Reynolds and his team. "They've earned that place. Anyone else joins only after they've demonstrated they deserve to be here." Reynolds felt a surge of pride at these words, not just for himself, but for his Marines. They had indeed earned Sullivan's respect, a currency of immeasurable value in the special operations community. "Of course," Clark agreed. "They're already written into the proposal as the founding cadre." Sullivan was silent for a long moment, studying each face around the table. Then he focused on Clark. Last condition. This isn't about me. It's about the knowledge, the principles, the lessons that matter. If this becomes some kind of monument to my career, I walk away immediately. Clark met Sullivan's gaze directly. Tom, that's precisely why I'm here. There are operators with more missions, more decorations, more publicity, but none with more wisdom or less ego. This program isn't about preserving your legend, it's about ensuring that what you know doesn't die with you. The blunt acknowledgement of mortality hung in the air. Sullivan didn't flinch from it. At his age and with his experience, death was an old acquaintance, not a stranger to be feared. Then we have an agreement, Sullivan said simply, extending his hand. Clark shook it firmly, the gesture sealing a compact between two men who had seen more of the world's shadows than most could imagine. There's paperwork, Clark said, reaching for his briefcase, but we can handle that later. For now, I'd like to hear your assessment of today's training, if you're willing to share it. And just like that, the formal moment passed, transitioning back into the familiar pattern of post-training debriefs that had characterized their previous sessions. Sullivan provided his observations on each Marine's performance, direct but constructive, identifying strengths to build upon and weaknesses to address. What was different this time was the added perspective Clark occasionally offered, connecting Sullivan's tactical insights to strategic objectives, helping the Marines understand how the micro skills they were developing contributed to macro mission success. It was, Reynolds realized, the perfect synthesis of operational levels, Sullivan's ground-level expertise combined with Clark's strategic overview, creating a comprehensive understanding that neither could have provided alone. As the evening progressed, the conversation gradually shifted from the day's training to broader topics. Clark shared sanitized versions of recent operations where historical knowledge would have made a difference, creating context for the skills. Sullivan was teaching without revealing classified details. Sullivan, in turn, became incrementally more open about his past experiences, still carefully avoiding specifics of classified missions, but providing enough context to help the Marines understand the real-world applications of what they were learning. Libya 84, Sullivan said at one point, responding to a question from Corporal Hernandez about desert operations. We had to extract an asset from a compound under surveillance. No tech support, no overhead imagery, no GPS. Just maps from the 1960s and local knowledge. He described, in appropriately vague terms, how his team had developed an approach that leveraged natural dust storms to mask their movement, using the environment itself as both cover and concealment. 2 weeks ago, Clark added, picking up the thread, a similar technique saved a team operating in the same region. The officer in charge had attended a briefing where Sullivan's methodology was presented as a case study. He adapted it to modern conditions and achieved complete surprise. This pattern continued throughout the evening, Sullivan providing historical context, Clark connecting it to current operations, the Marines absorbing both perspectives with growing appreciation for how past wisdom informed present action. As the night deepened and the conversation began to wind down, Lance Corporal Diaz asked a question that clearly had been on his mind throughout the day. Sir, he said, addressing Sullivan directly, with the program becoming official, will you finally receive recognition for your service? The operations that were classified, will they be acknowledged now? Sullivan shook his head slightly. That's not how this works, Marine. Some missions never see daylight, not because they're shameful, but because revealing them would create more problems than it would solve. He glanced at Clark. The best operations are the ones that history never records, because they prevented worse outcomes. Clark nodded in agreement. The paradox of our profession is that the most significant successes are often the ones no one ever hears about. The crisis that didn't happen, the war that didn't start, the disaster that was prevented. Before it began, these don't make headlines. Then how do you measure success? PFC Chen asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. If no one knows what you accomplished, how do you know your service mattered? It was a profound question, one that went to the heart of what it meant to serve in the shadows, to undertake missions that could never be acknowledged publicly. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the soft light of the cabin. When he spoke, his voice carried a depth of conviction that commanded complete attention. "You measure success by the silence," he said simply, "by the absence of the chaos that would have erupted if you had failed, by knowing that families slept safely because of actions they'll never know about, by understanding that some service isn't meant to be recognized, it's just meant to be, rendered faithfully." The Marines absorbed this wisdom in silence, each processing its implications for their own service and the meaning they derived from it. "That's why this program matters," Clark added quietly. "Not to create recognition for operations past, but to ensure that the wisdom gained from them isn't lost, so that future operators can benefit from lessons paid for in blood and sacrifice." Sullivan nodded once, accepting this framing of their purpose. "It's not about legacy," he said, his eyes moving from one Marine to the next. "It's about continuity, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the preservation of hard-earned wisdom." As the evening drew to a close, Clark prepared to depart, gathering his materials and thanking Sullivan for his hospitality. Before leaving, he addressed the Marines one final time. "What you're experiencing here is rare," he told them, his tone conveying the significance of his words. "In all my years of service, I've met only a handful of operators with Sullivan's combination of skill, experience, and wisdom. The fact that he's willing to share what he knows with you is a gift beyond measure." He glanced at Sullivan, who remained characteristically stoic. "Don't waste it." With that, he departed, leaving Sullivan and the Marines to conclude their evening as they had previous sessions, with quiet conversation around the fire pit outside the cabin. As they sat watching the flames dance against the night sky, Reynolds sensed a change in Sullivan, not dramatic, but noticeable to someone who had studied him closely over the past months. A subtle shift from the isolation that had characterized his post-service years toward something more connected, more engaged with the future of the profession he had served so faithfully. "Next month," Sullivan said as the fire burned low, "we'll begin something new. Now that the program has official status, I can share techniques that remain classified, methods developed for specific operational environments that still have relevance. Today." The Marines exchanged glances of anticipation, recognizing the significance of this statement. Sullivan was opening doors that had remained closed for decades, not out of a desire for recognition, but from a genuine commitment to ensuring that his knowledge served its purpose. "Until then," he continued, "study what we've covered so far, integrate it into your regular training. Test it, question it, improve it if you can." He looked at each of them in turn. "That's how knowledge evolves. Not through blind acceptance, but through thoughtful application and refinement." As they prepared to depart, Sullivan remained by the fire, his solitary figure silhouetted against the dying flames. Reynolds lingered briefly, feeling that something should be said to acknowledge the significance of what had transpired. "Thank you, sir," he said simply, "not just for the training, but for trusting us with your knowledge." Sullivan looked up, his expression softened slightly by the firelight. "Trust is earned, Staff Sergeant. Your Marines have earned it." He paused, then added something Reynolds would never forget. "Some men teach with words alone, others teach by example. The best teaching happens when those who know show those who don't, then step back and let them find their own way forward." It was, Reynolds realized, the perfect distillation of Sullivan's approach, not imposing his methods dogmatically, but sharing his knowledge generously, then allowing his students to adapt and evolve it for their own circumstances. As Reynolds joined his Marines for the drive back down the mountain, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a chance encounter at a shooting range. What had started as a moment of recognition, a Marine instructor noticing a tattoo on an old man's neck, had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated. A formal program that would preserve invaluable knowledge for future generations of operators. But beyond the official framework and the tactical lessons, something more significant had emerged, a philosophy of service that transcended any specific era or operational environment. Sullivan had shown them what it meant to serve with quiet, excellence, to accomplish extraordinary things without seeking recognition, to find meaning in the work itself rather than in the acknowledgement of others. It was a legacy far more valuable than any medal or commendation, a living tradition of principled service that would continue through them and those they would eventually teach. As their vehicles wound down the mountain road, Reynolds glanced back one last time at the distant glow of Sullivan's cabin. The quiet old man from the gun range had turned out to be so much more than anyone had imagined. Not just a former operator with impressive skills, but a carrier of wisdom that might otherwise have been lost to time. Some heroes, Reynolds reflected, were celebrated in headlines and history books. Others operated in shadows, their greatest achievements never acknowledged publicly. But the measure of their impact wasn't in the recognition they received. It was in the lives they touched, the missions they accomplished, and the knowledge they passed on when the time was right. Sullivan embodied that truth. And thanks to a chance encounter at a shooting range, a moment when an observant Marine noticed a faded tattoo on an old man's neck, his wisdom would continue to guide a new generation of warriors facing challenges he could only imagine. In the quiet excellence of his example, they had found not just a teacher, but a standard to aspire to. A reminder that true service isn't about recognition, but about the faithful execution of duty, regardless of who's watching or what history might record. And in a profession where the most important successes often remained unacknowledged, that was perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. So I ask you now, our viewers, have you ever encountered someone like Sullivan? A quiet professional whose depth of knowledge and experience was hidden beneath an unassuming exterior. Someone whose wisdom made you reconsider what true expertise looks like. Share their story in the comments below, because at Unsung Heroes, we believe the most powerful stories are often the ones that wait patiently to be discovered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.